So I just found a guidebook from Barcelona from the year 1854, and today we're gonna follow it around. Now this is a satirical guide, so it's gonna be a lot of fun. But why the year 1854 is so important is because that's the year that the walls of Barcelona come down. So it's much smaller than what we're looking at today. We're talking before the Barcelona Olympics, before the World's Fair in 1888, before mass tourism hits the city. So we'll see if this thing is gonna help us out at all. But before we follow this book around the city, we need to understand what the Barcelona of 1854 was like. The Eixample district, with its iconic gridded streets, didn't even exist. What's known as La Ciutat Vella, Barcelona's old city today, was the city of Barcelona. What that means is we had the neighborhoods known as the Gothic Quarter, El Born, El Raval, and La Barceloneta. The medieval walls of the city were still up, and Barcelona had the highest population density in Europe, with around 187,000 people packed into this small area. Barcelona wasn't the beautiful city it's known as today. With so many people forced into such a tiny living area, the citizens had been calling for the walls to come down for decades. The common cries for "Abajo las murallas," bring down the walls, were finally met on August 24th, 1854, just after this guidebook had originally been published. The whole guidebook starts out talking about the old medieval walls and the gates to get into the city. And they're really looking into the future. What's so important about having a guidebook from 1854 and puts things into perspective is it was the last year that those walls were going to be up. The ordinance came in to tear them down, and Barcelona was never going to be the same again. Now, it's really funny what they say. Check it out. The architecture of the sea gates of Barcelona will be excellent for when travel will be done through the air, and hot air balloons will have replaced buses, railways, and even steamships. When then the sea and ships will be among the many useless things that are preserved in the world, and that men have called advancements to avoid labeling their meager and feeble science as backward. We're talking about flying over the city walls and seeing them, and we're not talking about airplanes. We're talking about hot air balloons and things of the like, right? Completely different times. But while we don't have those walls up anymore, there are little parts that we can still find around the city. And the first mentions of all the gates is the Puerta del Mar, which we don't really have anymore. It's really only a little bit that's left, which is hidden just outside of the Barceloneta, and I covered in one of my hidden gems of the Born area. Really just a little bit left of what was the most important part and maybe the entrance and exit of the city. And what's interesting is they talk about this idea that it was the only place that you could get in and out, and why the city was forcing people to go through such a small area to get in and out. They could really fix it all up and make it a lot better. We don't understand why our authorities force people to enter and exit through a very limited space, when through a very simple operation, Barcelona could have on this side the most magnificent and comfortable entrance that exists in any capital. Now, one thing that I always consider, because nowadays we're coming in through the airport, through those train stations, is we have a different idea of what is the entrance or kind of the beginning of Barcelona. Even La Rambla itself, I always think of it as kind of walking down from the Plaza Catalunya is that start. But maybe back in the day, the entrance really was to the city. Barcelona is a big port city, and its tradition of the sea is so important. So maybe coming in was that entrance to a lot of people, and going up La Rambla is really a start. The Puerta de Ángel is the second gate that they mention as one of the places to get into that city. And it still is one of the main entranceways to get into that old city, leading right down to that cathedral. But what they mention in here is that for a long time, it's only a place where those carriages, where those coaches are coming in. The Angel Gate long ago passed only to coaches and coachmen. This middle ground of nature between the men who ride inside the carriages and the animals that pull them. Because of how dismantled and old everything is, it looks more like an empty barracks or a suppressed convent. And now, you can see, there's really not any space for those cars at all to come through. You might have some trucks dropping some things off, but everything's blocked off, and it's really just a passageway for walking. And really what you have today are just a bunch of shops. One of those gates that's still left today, and really the largest that we have on display, is Santa Madrona. And in the guidebook, what they mention is that it's the least transited. And it's probably just like that today, despite the fact that it is the largest of the walls that you can still see. And it has the Maritime Museum on the inside, a museum that probably doesn't get all of the publicity that it should. The St. Madrona Gate is a unique thing. It's a mixture of civil and military. It is the least traveled, and its appearance in harmony with the Royal Boathouse Barracks, of which it can be said to be a part, leads one to believe that instead of giving entrance to a city, it gives passage to a citadel. If you get over here, you'll see that there's a lot of people walking around, but it's not really much of a tourist attraction. It is over by the port, so all of the cruise ship people coming in do probably see it, but it's not something that maybe a lot of tours go over to. And one of the other walls that they mention in the guidebook is the Puerta de San Antonio. Now, we don't really have all of that wall left, and really it's more of a newer discovery. You've probably heard of the San Antonio Market. Just underground, what they found were parts of that old wall. Realistically, more of an extension than those old doors, but you do have a little bit to come on over and explore. The St. Anthony Gate is in a terrible state. So bad that it's only comparable to the other gates of Barcelona. Through it pass those who are being taken to hang. And upon my life, even in grace of these sayings, it should be kept a bit more decent. Without a doubt, it has the worst entrance to the capital. If one were to judge by this gate, especially at certain times of the day, a traveler might imagine that they have arrived at a new court of miracles. Particularly when it rains, it's better to enter by boat than by carriage. It's not in as bad of condition as described in the guidebook. But notice how all the references to the old gates are super negative and talk about the bad condition or their lack of purpose. You really get a feel for the public opinion at the time and the push to get those walls down. But it wasn't just space that became an issue. Public health and safety were at risk. The poor lighting in the streets and the lack of ventilation were problems that were only worsened by Barcelona's winding streets. Things that are so popular amongst visitors today. Here's how they were described in 1854. As for our streets drawn with a cord, it may well be that they amount to 3. Take a tangled spool of thread, tangle it more, much more, and the result will roughly give you the copy of the plan of Barcelona. Or what is the same? A labyrinth of lines, forming angles, triangles, circles, and semicircles, but never parallel. So it's crazy, and even following these things around, a book that's written in 1854 is still kind of what the charm is of the Gothic Quarter, the old city today. I think everybody that comes in is always just overwhelmed with all the winding streets. And the big question I always get is basically, how did you find your way around? Do you ever get lost? There's not a lot of kind of order to all of this. That doesn't come around until the Plan Cerdà, when they open up that whole Rambla. But other larger boulevards and promenades did exist at this time, like La Rambla, or even the beginnings of the Paseo de Gracia. So he talks about a bunch of different paseos públicos, these walkways and everything. The Rambla is obviously the one that is most talked about. And even today, it's the most visited street probably in all of Barcelona. And what's really funny is that they refer to it as a dance floor, but a place where it's someone who probably just give you an elbow and you lose like a rib or break a rib or something like that. The Rambla Promenade is a true masquerade ballroom where parents and children, daughters and sons simultaneously indulge in pranks. In this place, it's not uncommon for an elbow to leave one's dress shirt buttons lodged into their ribs, or for a heavy step to make one see stars in the middle of the day. Now, I find it hard to believe that in 1854, there was even more people on than we have all around us today, but it's always interesting to see still people were going back over 100 years ago. Sounds like La Rambla in 1854 was still a pretty popular spot. But what all could you do along Las Ramblas back then? Today, you have to visit the Boqueria, definitely the city's best-known market. Now, when we talk about the markets in 1854, they really only name 3. There's a lot more in the city today, but they start with San Jose, which is better known as La Boqueria, where we are right now. The second one is Santa Catalina, which is over in the Born, and probably a lot less busy than what we have over here. And last but not least, we've got the Born. But the Born has been turned into a museum, and it's no longer that market anymore. What's really funny about the Boqueria is that it says one of them is St. Joseph's, which started to be built about 13 or 14 years ago. And now more than a third of it is completed. Another notable thing in this place is the fish market, a kind of cage where buyers are often trapped like birds. So 1854, it still had a lot of people coming over here. Now today, this is the most visited market in all of Barcelona. You can see just trying to get in, it's like you're in a jail cell, but it's not that bad. If you want to come over, take a visit. And today, one of the common stops along La Rambla is at the Fountain of Canaletas. The guidebook mentions quite a few fountains in the city, some of which are still around today. The Canaletas fountain almost seems to spring forth from the rocks. And for many years, it has indeed emerged from among the ruins. One of those fountains, and one of my favorites to show off to people coming into the city, especially for the first time, is the Fountain of Canaletas. Maybe a little bit more famous today than what it was back in those times. But now, still over here, that fountain right at the top of Las Ramblas, Canaletas, probably better known for the big celebrations for Football Club Barcelona after those big wins. But you also have a plaque right here that says, if you drink from the water of the fountain of Canaletas, no matter how far you go, you'll have fallen in love with the city and you'll always be able to return. And what about the Passeig de Gracia? While it was created 30 years earlier, it doesn't seem to be the grand street that it is today, or the safest place to be in 1850 Barcelona. The Paseo de Gracia presents no more inconvenience than swallowing dust at every step or risking being run over by a carriage while crossing one of its streets. This promenade would offer so much security to peaceful pedestrians that the authorities, merely as a precaution, have had to place more guards there than found in a camp. Quite the difference 170 years later. Now one of the places anyone who visits Barcelona today goes to see the famous modernist houses. But let's head back to the Barcelona of 1854. What was around at this time to see? The oldest fountain in the city is still around today. The Santa Ana Fountain, a sort of monstrous drum and watering hole for horses, which often causes bipeds to drink the drool of quadrupeds. So it looks like the oldest fountain in Barcelona, which I think not even a lot of people even pay much attention to it. It's just right down at the end of the Porta del Ángel. But what is really a piece of historic parts of Barcelona doesn't get much attention today. And in 1854, the Gothic Quarter wasn't what it is today. The book doesn't even make a mention of that name because it itself didn't exist. The Gothic Quarter is a project starting around the time of the World's Fair in the neighborhood that was simply known as the area of the cathedral. And the cathedral would have looked a little different back then as well. The cathedral was started during the Moorish times, but since the Moors haven't returned to finish it, we wonder why it's not completed. That's how the saying goes in Catalonia. It's longer than the work on the cathedral. Obviously, this guy had never heard of the Sagrada Familia. All right, so two things. This actually wasn't started during the Muslim time here in Barcelona. It wasn't started actually until 1298, but it wasn't going to be finished until 1913. Hence that phrase of not finished until or after La Seu, which is the nickname for the cathedral. Second thing, in 1854, the Sagrada Familia hadn't even been started. That wasn't started until 1882. The Sagrada Familia is known for the length of time it's taken to be built, but the cathedral was the original building of Mañana. After running out of money 150 years into the construction phase, the cathedral was left unfinished until that push to complete it ahead of the World's Fair. The rest of what is known as the Gothic Quarter today would change as well. And with it, many of the buildings, streets, and plazas would be changed over the decades following the publication of this guidebook. There are quite a few plazas mentioned in our guidebook, but there's two that I really want to focus on. And the first of those is the Plaza de la Constitución, which if you look on a map of Barcelona, you're not going to find any. Because today it's called Sant Jaume. You've probably been here. If you've been over to that Gothic Quarter, it is the government square. Where that name comes from today and why it's changed is because originally there was the church of Sant Jaume right in this square. But what happened, this is just a little bit before the book was written, and they talk about it a little bit later, is that the Ferran Street connecting La Rambla down to the park, what turns into Princesa Street, had to cut through the plaza. And so a lot of different things changed. This plaza would have been much, much smaller as some things changed. So now what you have is that City Hall building with a completely different facade. But what I think is crazy is that in the book, how he refers to the Plaza de la Constitución is the Constitution Square is notable for its pavement, which costs 3 times more than the others. And it's 3 times worse and 3 times uglier. But you can still see that original facade just around the corner. So let's go check it out. While we still have that original facade, you can see there are some changes and maybe a miscalculation or two. That other plaza is the Plaza Nueva, or today the Plaza Nova. And if it wasn't new in 1854, it's definitely not any newer in 2024. And as he writes, the new square could have been so in the times of Wilfrid the Hairy. It has 2 towers at the entrance of Bishop Street. And if one day there were thoughts of tearing them down, the public ornamentation would not lose anything. Which is just crazy to think. Something so iconic as the 2 towers leading into that Roman city inside of that Gothic Quarter. If they weren't here, that would be a big loss. It's one of the big things that everybody always sees when they come in. The Plaza Nueva now is much bigger than before. What they used to have over here were buildings and even a place for cars to park. They've taken out a lot of those buildings over the year, moved some of them around into different parts of the Gothic Quarter, and now you have a big central square in front of that cathedral where you've got that Gothic market that's there on some weekends during the year, and actually where I got this book. So what did you think? A lot has changed in the 170 years since that guidebook was written, but it's nice to know that there's still some things around from those old times. Let me know with a comment below if you want to see more videos looking at the old Barcelona.